Right, so my talk I've titled Figma Frontiers. So I'm going to be talking about like being at the cutting edge of Figma and also having a mindset of embracing and exploring new features as they come out, so you can level up your design superpowers. So, that's Abe Lincoln. I came across this great quote, which is like, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree. I'll spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. I like this quote, and there's a lot of different ways you could take this analogy, and I'm going to take them all within the context of Figma, and how it's all about knowing your tools of the trade, right? So I'm going to dive a bit deeper into Figma, but who here actually uses Figma? Okay, awesome. I'd say that's almost everyone, good majority. It's come a long way. So yeah, I'll dive into that a little bit deeper. I'm going to talk about how, we should be trying to embrace our tools as much as possible. And then get to like how I did that and also made Flappy Bird in Figma. But first, all right, who am I? So as Chan said, I'm Dave Williams, and I'm a bit of a Figma fanboy. So much so that I managed to even have the Figma handle just Dave as my profile handle. Ooh. So, I'm pretty legit. I've been actively using Figma actually for about 5 years, and I came across it a bit more of understanding it from the DesignOps meetup 5 years ago, where I think Adam spoke there as well and talked about life after Sketch. Yeah. Which is how I came across it. Apart from that, I've been a product designer for much longer than that. Yeah, back in the Sketch days and all that. But also I do a bit of development in my spare time. So beyond just using Figma, some of you might know, but I also create some plugins. I'll quickly just skim through a couple in case you've heard of them. So this is a classic, Lorem Ipsum. It's got about 650,000 users, which is insane. But actually, as of like a week ago, I don't own it anymore. It's been acquired by Div Riots, which are the folks who built HTML to design, which is another awesome plugin. So that's pretty cool. Some other stuff I've worked on, I've got this Google Sheets sync plugin, which lets you sync content from a URL. Yeah, I'm sure if you have... That makes me nervous because I know there's quite a few bugs in it, and if you... yeah, hit me up afterwards if... we'll see what we can do. One other one, which is a fun one, image tracer. So you can grab a bitmap image, trace it into a vector, and recently I've made an update so you'll actually trace it in colors as well. So now you can like change colors and it's a actual vector. Woo, very cool. And my most recent one, it's called Contentinator, where it's all about using AI to, I guess, create content, but bulk fill them in your designs, which is great if you want to just stress test a design and you don't want to think of what the content would be. Yeah, it's handy. And it also has the whole text to image stuff. It can write for you. All the good AI things you might expect. Anywho, not here to talk about those plugins, but a little bit more of the mindset of beyond just plugins. One thing I love doing is when Figma releases new features, I want to try and push them to their limits. Pull them apart. So like one of the things I did a year or so ago when they released interactive components was I made a Minesweeper, and a pretty much fully working version of Minesweeper. You go through and click on all the mines and stuff. That was a cool way just to test out how interactive components worked. I also built out a version of Sudoku and stuff. But more recently, Figma released variables and advanced prototyping. So yeah, one of the things I ended up making was Flappy Bird fully working, which I'll dive into a little bit more later. But you might have seen my tweet or post on X, whatever it's called now, which is insane to me that it blew up and got like over 1 million views. So that's cool. But outside of Figma, I'm more than just a Figma boy. I work at Ferocia, which is a company you might not have heard of. But Ferocia is a fintech company that got acquired by Bendigo Bank about 2 years ago. And the main thing they work on, you might be able to tell from my jumper, is Up. Woo! So Up, if you don't know about Up, it's all about helping you have better control over your finances and feel better about about them. So like, who's heard of Up? Yes, nice. Who's used Up? Ooh, a good chunk, but not everyone. I'm a bit, like, before I joined there, I was a big fan. I've used Up for almost 5 years, and I love some of the stuff, like the ethically what they do with money as well. So, for example, it was a big thing for a while of the whole, buy now, pay later, and you're just helping young people accrue a lot of debt. But Up's take on it was save now, buy later. They called it May Buy, and it was a whole take on like lay-bys. Anyway, very cool. I love working for them, and there's a reason why it's one of the highest rated banking app in Australia. I can't help myself, but I thought I would plug it. So if you haven't used it, I did manage to get a referral code set up. So if you do DesignOps 10, if you haven't used it before, you'd be crazy not to sign up now, because you just get $10 just for doing that. So that's cool. And while I'm in my sales pitch mode, we are actually hiring at the moment for a senior product designer role, which is really rare. We don't have that many. Like, it's pretty rare that we're hiring someone. And what I love about Ferocia, for the quick sales pitch, is it's just full of a whole lot of doers. Like, there's no fluff. It's very flat structure, very lean. So like, for example, our dev squads just involves a couple of engineers and a designer, and that's it. Like, we don't have any product owners or BAs or QA or delivery leads or any of that. We just make stuff and ship it. There's a lot of autonomy. It's awesome. If you want to know more, chat to me or chat to Sam actually from Iterate. We're going through those guys to try and get some good people. So, you'd be crazy not to. Anyway. All right. So let's jump back to this axe. This is where we started. So with this quote. Now, in this context, in axe, it's like a tool for your job, and for a lumberjack, they would know their axe intimately, right? Like, they would know it would be perfectly weighted. They'd have it nice and sharp, make sure they're not getting splinters, and, nice grip and all that. So for us, I'm going to kind of refer to within this analogy of, for us as designers and everyone who said they use Figma, if you're using it day to day, that is like your axe. That is your tool. So, how intimately do you know Figma, and how much do you explore it? So this quote could be pulled apart in a couple of different ways, which I thought was interesting. So the first one being like kind of the knowledge of, sharpening your axe. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but, you need to know that it's worth investing the time to sharpen the axe to be sharp, and it'll be better for cutting trees. Preparation, you need to set that aside of time to sharpen it before trying to cut down that tree. And then adaptability. So, are you using the right tool? Like, cool, you're using that axe to chop down a tree. Did you know chainsaws are a thing? So I'm going to chat about these a little bit more within the context of Figma. So hopefully there's something kind of applicable here, or at least we'll just challenge some of your thinking of like, am I really trying to be on the cutting edge of what there is? So firstly, knowledge. Knowing how to use Figma well and all its ins and outs will not necessarily, that doesn't mean you're a good designer. So what does make you a good designer? Well, obviously, naming your layers makes you a good designer. Which I'm joking. No, but I think you could argue, even though knowing Figma and how to use it doesn't make you a good designer, but I would argue if you are a good designer, you better hope that you know Figma really well, because that's going to help unleash a lot more, capabilities and what you can do. Otherwise, you might be holding yourself back a little bit, right? You want to be moving faster. So if we switch analogies a little bit, I was just thinking about this of, if you think of like a professional photographer, right? Now, like, everyone has a pretty good camera on their phone in their pocket these days. Cool, you can probably take a decent photo with it. They've all got pretty decent megapixels and all that. But it's going to vary between everyone of how good that looks based on your knowledge of, composition, all that kind of stuff. But if you put a smartphone in the hands of a professional photographer, they're going to make something a lot better. But to get even better photos, they're going to use something like a DSLR, and where they've got a lot more control of. You can do, change the ISO levels and exposure and having the right lens and lens filter things. I'm not a professional photographer. But having those better tools and knowing how to use them will yield better results. So now imagine you hired a pro photographer for your wedding, and they're just out there taking photos with their iPhone, right? And you're like, dude, where's your fancy camera? And they're like, I don't actually really know how to use them. You'd be like, what? You're hiring a pro. You'd expect that for knowing them. So a little bit of a thought, which may be kind of controversial, but if you're hiring a product designer to maybe create some designs in Figma, and maybe they do it without using like auto layout or components or styles or anything because they didn't know how to use them, then it's the same deal. Like, you're hiring a pro, you'd at the very least expect them to know that. Now, I'm not saying you need to be using all those things in all your designs. It's very different to not knowing how to use them compared to knowing how, but deciding, for this project, I'm not going to do it. But yeah, that's one of the key things and of this talk, I guess, is to think for yourself, like, how intimately do you know Figma and how personalized have you made it with like plugins and things? Could you be getting more out of it? So, I mean, to be honest, like, using Figma is just creating fancy rectangles and text boxes. That's all it is, which anyone can really do. So, however, if you're a pro, it's all about the mastery of your tools, right? That's what sets us apart as professionals. So, I know like some designers who just don't bother learning about any like features or how to really use it. And they're just limiting themselves. They're basically like a pro photographer who only knows how to use an iPhone. Yeah. So, the next thing's being like preparation. You need to set aside some of this time to really digest and explore new features and all that. So, say you're starting a new job and they use Sketch. Like, oh no. I mean, I don't know why you'd start there anyway if they're not using Figma. But now what, right? You got to spend a bunch of time learning Sketch, and yeah, you should. You should pull it apart and really understand it all. Or same deal, Figma might drop a whole new feature set like variables. And maybe before you dive into creating a whole new design of a feature, or maybe you're about to build out this big crazy prototype or about to set up a design system, maybe before doing that, you should at the very least understand what variables is and can do to make sure that you know about it, so you're not limiting yourself. These images are really weird, by the way, because they used AI to generate them. So I don't know why there's another random spark thing, but it's good fun. You'll find little like nuggets in all of it. Anyway, so it's all about like investing that 4 hours to sharpen a tree, right? Sharpen your axe before chopping down the tree. You want to get primed for the job. So last thing, that adaptability of using the right tool for the job. This kind of comes in two ways. You want to make sure you're not using a tool where, it's weird, where it doesn't make sense to. So, for example, if you've got an axe and you love using your axe, everything's going to look like a tree, and you're going to want to chop it down. Same deal with Figma. Maybe you just love turning everything into a component. Everything needs to be a component, but maybe it doesn't make sense to. Or maybe you've got this one crazy component and it's full of variants. You got 1,000 variants in there, but it makes more sense to be separate components. I mean, there's a whole lot of ways you could talk about this. But the other thing as well is just not using the right tool for the job. Look at all these crazy AI-generated tools. I have no idea what any of them are. But yeah, like picking the right one. So for example, maybe you've just been creating a whole lot of designs in different sizes when you should have been using auto layout and constraints, like could have helped with all that. There's not always a right way to do things. It's not black and white. But the idea is to at least have some sort of knowledge of knowing what exists so that you can be informed with that. So, know your tools and how to leverage them effectively. You need to prepare, set aside the time to like sharpen your axe and use the right tools and features where it makes sense to. And knowledge really underpins a lot of this. So how do you go about learning a new feature or something? I think there's a couple of things. So the first thing is awareness of just knowing that something exists, or that Figma, for example, has released something. And by the way, everything where I'm talking about with Figma, maybe you don't use Figma as your tool, but this could really apply to any tool of just first things being aware. So how can you stay aware? I'll just pump through a whole lot of things specifically to Figma. They have their newsletter and mailing list. Make sure you're on that. That's great for their big releases of things. I went to take a screenshot of a recent one, and then small little humble brag, I realized they talked about my Flappy Bird thing, so that's cool. Anyway, there's this other one called, I don't know how it's pronounced, if it's Figma Lion or Figmalion. But this is a great fortnightly newsletter, which has not just about for features, but it'll be like, these are cool new plugins to be using, or these are cool new articles which dive into stuff. Figma had the release notes page where sometimes they slip through cool little features which are very easy to miss. I mean, there's a cool one this morning about using ChatGPT and FigJam, but even 2 days ago, they had a whole lot of updates to variables of having like syntax stuff and more scoping of colors. And yeah, so that's a good one to be across some of that. If you're on X, Twitter, Zitter, follow them. Jump on stuff like the Aussie Designers Slack channel or DesignOps. Slack channel can be a good way. Sometimes there's some good discussions there. Or Figma even have a Discord server, which you may not know about, called Friends of Figma. This is a good area where they post a lot of all their announcements and people chat about all things Figma if you want to dive in and learn more. So yeah, but now you might be aware of all these things. Hey, there's this new feature which just dropped. What's the best way of digesting it? Like everyone learns differently, but I think you need to actually do something with it to digest it properly and for it to solidify. And I love this approach. It's the idea of dabble before you dive. I stole this from, there's a YouTuber called Jazza. He's an Aussie dude. He does a lot of experiments with different mediums of art. So it'll be like resin painting or sculpting or whatever. And his whole approach is this, like he dabbles and then he dives. So with dabble, start to play with like a little bit of the thing, understand its constraints, see what you can do with it, how you can pull it apart, and then dive. Like actually try and do something big with it. Then you'll learn even more, and at the end you got something to show for it, which is cool. So, and then the next step I think is just like sharing with others. It's the best way to learn is by teaching or sharing, but also it's good for the community just to share and everyone learns stuff. So that's kind of my approach, how I think of it. So I thought I'd chat through a little bit more quickly, more specifically about how I approach this when variables dropped a couple of months ago. So Figma released all this. I learned about it just because they had their config conference, but also it was a big release. So Dabble. The way I went to Dabble in this of variables is the first way of just playing through their playground file, which Figma released. And these are great if you've ever played around with them. They go through like all different pages where you can step through and learn everything. This is a good way to kind of just immerse yourself and dabble in like what is possible, but then actually play around with it yourself. So here's the very first thing I built was a little counter. So running through it, setting up my first variable. It's a number. It's just called number. And then you can tie that to that text label, choose the variable, and then hook up some actions to the plus and minus button, where now they have actions where you can set a variable. So in this case, it'll be number will equal number plus 1, or number equals number minus 1 for decrementing. Very exciting. So that's the very first little bit. But then I thought, okay, well, let's add one more thing to it. So I added a condition. So it worked, but you could go below 0. So now we can do things like add a condition where maybe you only want to decrement if the number is above 0. So you don't end up running down to negative numbers. I think I skipped before actually showing it before, but here you can see, plus minus, it doesn't keep going minus. Cool. Now we're making it even fancier by adding a condition. Then I started playing around a little bit more with some different stuff of like, okay, what if I grab a box and I wrap it in auto layout? You can actually move the bottom padding, but then you could tie that to a variable. So if we tie that to that same number variable, now when we run it, whenever you're hitting the plus or minus, the box can move up and down. You might be seeing where I'm going with this. But then there was one other kind of interesting thing I wanted to play with interactive components. So if I have, say, these two components, tick and tock, combine them as a variant, and I can make them automatically swap between each other. So after a little bit of a delay. And anyway, then they just tick tock on the screen. I'll just skip forward. Oh no, that video did go a bit longer. Anyway, they TikTok, but then you can set that up as well at the same time to change the variable. So it'll just keep looping and you can increment infinitely. So that box would just keep going up, which is cool. So now is the time to dive. I'd played around with it and I found a couple of cool techniques and things there. I was like, I reckon I could make Flappy Bird. we'll see how we go. So here's a bit of a glimpse into it. The actual playground file for Flappy Bird is available in the Figma community if you do really want to dig into it. But I'll just break down a couple of interesting things. Not that this will be applicable at all to any of your prototypes for actual things, but I found it kind of interesting. So I stole some assets from online, and so I've got my Flappy Bird. One of the things, like I showed before, was you've got the bottom padding is wrapped within an auto layout container. So I linked that to a variable called Y position. And then I had this thing whereas velocity would continuously just keep going down. And each time you clicked, it would just pump up that velocity value. So using that velocity value, you would know how much to change the Y position each time. You can see the frames like ticking up really, really fast. So yeah, without going into details of the actual formula for it, that's kind of how that works. And so now jumping could work. That's pretty sick. So then the next thing was, okay, well, how do I put the pipes in the ground so that it keeps moving? And I made the box a little bit wider so you can see a bit of a glimpse of this. So the ground just keeps, once it gets to a certain point, it just jumps all the way back. And there's only 2 pipes and they just keep cycling around. But because it's all chopped off, it feels like you got an infinite amount of pipes continually coming through. That's how I did that. And then the last thing was just linking that all up with like some collision detection of basically if you're in between the pipes at a certain point, whenever that Y position is changing, if you hit them, then you die. And then you can just start it again. There's a lot of interesting techniques and stuff in here. Yeah, you can play through the playground file if you want to know more, or just chat to me later if you're really interested. But this was that next step after kind of the doubling and then diving and then sharing. So like I tweeted about it, made that file accessible. Then even at work, like I ran a little bit of a workshop talking through it and some of the learnings from variables. Yeah, which I think was really interesting. So some of the learnings I found from just dabbling around and playing with all these variables is it's not a silver bullet. I think a lot of people, when they saw that example of Flappy Bird, they're like, oh my goodness, we've replaced the need to code. We can make anything in Figma. It is not true at all. I chose Flappy Bird specifically. I built that given the constraints of what I found when I was dabbling. So I can't do everything. In fact, variables can't actually do that much yet. So I wouldn't just adopt them for the sake of it. So say, for example, even if anyone's thinking of moving all their color styles to variables, or being like, oh, that's the thing you're supposed to do. If you're not like got different modes for like dark mode, light mode and stuff of colors, or if you're not trying to do aliasing, there's no point because variables can't even support gradients or anything like that. So I wouldn't even bother. But some interesting ideas of what I did think of is like if you're creating a prototype and it's got like a user's name throughout it and you're doing some user testing, someone's going to come in and play around with that, set up a variable for like that person's name of like where it's everywhere. And then before giving it to that person to test, just change the variable to their name and then it will feel personalized straight away, but you've got all these places which have just like synced with that name. That's a cool little thing. Or just start small, like maybe it's just consistent corner radiuses, radii everywhere. Yeah, so look, everyone's going to work differently. I'm not saying that everyone should be using variables and components in auto layout. It's also okay to not be up to date with everything. Like the world is pretty crazy in general. So you shouldn't necessarily have that extra pressure on yourself. But I think it is important to intentionally have that mindset of at some point carving out the time to play with new features and be at the cutting edge of Figma and explore those frontiers. Yeah, so think to yourself of like what is your tool? Maybe it's Figma, maybe it's not. How familiar are you with it? What would be your equivalent of spending the time sharpening the axe? Like what are your gaps of knowledge? And are you setting up some time to do that? But you know, it's good to remember as product designers, the tools we use are important, but they don't create the product that we do. So like ultimately the tool is just an extension of stuff that are helping us bring ideas to life. So don't get too caught up in it. Yeah, that's all I had to share. If you have any, do we have time for questions? Do you want to do questions or questions? Oh, thank you.